But it's great to see you all here today. As you can tell, things are a little different today. Things are a little bit different today. We're doing something just a little bit different for today. This is a one Sunday kind of a message. We wanted to do something a little bit different, especially around communion. And to kind of help bring back some of that significance of what communion is and what is actually communion. Why is it that we're doing communion? Like what is communion all about? We wanted to do something special. Because every time that I look around the community and I see churches for a long time, and this isn't an FCC thing, this is an America thing, where we have stopped making it so special. We've stopped making it so important, and it's become more tradition and more something that we have to do instead of something that you want to do. So how do we get there? How did we get there? Where did we go from there? How do we actually figure this out? So today I wanted to actually talk to you about communion, and we wanted to do something different, something a little uncomfortable, something a little bit fun, and something a little bit different, as evidenced by you guys now sitting at the tables and having awkward conversations to people that you don't know, which is awesome, right? So today we're going to do it. And I will tell you this, as I was thinking through this week, how communion was significant to me, when it actually became significant. I remember the exact time where communion for me became super significant, where all of a sudden I understood what communion really was. It didn't come from a church. It wasn't at a church gathering. It wasn't at anything like that. It was actually at a wedding. The most embarrassing and craziest wedding I have ever been to in my life. It was actually at a wedding with a friend of mine. He was in the Marine Corps. We're in the Marine Corps together, and he was getting hitched to this girl that he had just basically met. That's a Marine Corps thing, right? So happens all the time. And now all of a sudden, he wants to get married in a hurry. They had a wedding like 4 months ahead, but they couldn't wait. So he's like, we're going to elope, and I need you to be my best man and my witness. So we did what anybody else would do. We found a preacher on Craigslist. And from Craigslist, we were able to find a retired Episcopal preacher. And this was a woman, and this woman, she had retired for a long time, and she had an ad on Craigslist, "I'll marry you quick." Okay, you know it's great when it's that. So all of a sudden, she also said, "Look, I won't come to any place, I can't go any place, but would you come to my house?" And we said, okay. So now as the best man and the witness, I go to this house to get these two hitched together with this Episcopal priest. And as we walk into the house, all of a sudden we get so blown away by the incredibleness of all of the porcelain dolls around the house. This whole house was filled with porcelain dolls. She had the biggest, it should be a museum. There was the biggest collection of porcelain dolls I have ever seen in my life. There were shelves and shelves and shelves of them, and that was the backdrop of the wedding. That was the backdrop of the pictures, was porcelain dolls. And they weren't even like the nice porcelain dolls, like happy ones that you get in the 1990s and the 2000s. These were ones that were collector's editions from the 1800s, when things were hard, when things were burnt. It was crazy. She had all of these dolls everywhere, and now we're just looking at each other going, this is crazy, this is absurd, this is nuts. And then it gets compounded. It gets compounded by the fact that she had a stomach problem. She was a super sweet lady, an amazing lady. She was awesome, but she had a stomach problem, and every time that she was trying to get through the vows, she kept burping and kept saying stuff like, would you, Autumn, would you, one sec. It was hard. Now, we were really nice, though. We were trying to be super nice and respectful and not laugh or anything like that. But then we lost it. We lost it at one point when all of a sudden she said, we're all gathered here today. We're gathered here today in front of all of our witnesses, and she pointed to the porcelain dolls. And we couldn't keep it in anymore. My friend laughed so hard, and he couldn't keep it in. He backed up into a table, which backed up into a bookshelf, and just like in a movie, it went bam, 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 porcelain dolls. And now the porcelain dolls were on the floor judging us. But this woman was the sweetest woman in the world. She could have been angry. She could have been frustrated. She could have had all these problems. There could have been a craziness going on, but no, she didn't. She was the sweetest one in the world. And she just continued to move on and said, let's continue to bless this marriage. And then afterwards, she could have made us feel guilty. She could have made us feel wrong. She could have done something, but she didn't. She looked at us and she said, would you all join me for a meal? We broke half of her dolls. What were we going to say? No? It would have been wrong. So we said, yeah, we'll join you for a meal. And we go into her kitchen, and she brought out some snacks, and she tried to find some snacks and some things for us to eat, and it was super sweet. And while we were eating with her, she then said, you know, you're all Christians, right? And we said, yeah. And she says, can we all take communion together? Now, this was something that was foreign to me. You see, I grew up in a way, and I thought in a way when I was going to the church and going all these times, I thought that you could only take communion in church. Communion is what you do in church. You do it on Sundays. You do it then. It was a very traditional thing. We need a priest to bless it. We need to have all of this stuff. And she was telling me that we can have communion at her home at the end of the wedding. And I confronted her, and I was like, well, should we do that? I mean, we're not in a church. We're in your home with all the porcelain dolls. She said, no, you can take communion anywhere. That you can take communion anywhere. In fact, in the early church, that was what they did. They had communion in their homes. I said, okay, then yeah, we'll take communion with you. And then she looked around her kitchen, and she looked around to find all the communion elements, and she found some little communion cups. They hadn't been washed in years. They were like dried up wine and stuff on it and everything. I'm a bit of a germaphobe, so I had to pray real hard before I took anything from that. But now all of a sudden, here's these little communion cups, and she couldn't find any grape juice. She couldn't find any wine, and she didn't have any bread. She felt embarrassed, and then she said, well, but I do have something. She brought out tortilla chips, and she brought out a grape juice kind of soda thing. She said, well, we'll do it with this. And now me and my friend were like, well, wait a minute, that's confusing to us because we're supposed to do it with Welch's on a Sunday. It's supposed to be Welch's and only Welch's, right? That is what we do communion with. She said, no, you can actually do it with anything. It's not about the elements. She said, if it was about the elements, then you would always have to take communion with unleavened bread and wine. But in every church, we do it different. There's bread, or there's different kinds of bread. In the back there's Cheesecake Factory bread. And we take it with Welch's or not. You can take it with what you have. And she said, if it was the early church, we would have been doing it with wine. She said, we can do it with anything. It's not about the elements. It's about the heart. It's about what it means to you, and it's about Jesus. And all of a sudden, we started to make sense. I was like, wow, that's really interesting. I never thought of it about that way. I thought it was something we just go to church and we just do. Like, this is something that we have to do because it's a commandment. And because it's a commandment, we have to do this. She said, no, it's about your heart and who Jesus is. And then she did something crazy. And she said, would you pray for communion? I said, I'm not a pastor. I can't pray for communion. If I pray for communion, nothing's going to happen. But if somebody who's a pastor, who's ordained, who has a certificate or something from a university, that's when all of a sudden things happen. She said, no, you can take communion with anybody. You can pray together as a group. Communion is about coming together with Jesus, inviting Jesus in and saying, Jesus, we want to spend time with you. We want to remember you. We want to know you. That's what communion is. We thought, man, that's crazy. So for the very first time in my life, I prayed in front of people. I used to have a fear of praying in front of people. I got over it at some points. But now all of a sudden, here I am, and we're praying in front of people for communion. Me and my friend, we went back, and it was a couple weeks later that all of a sudden we were on a Marine Corps campout, which is what we would say for being in the field, being rained on and tortured for weeks. It was horrible. But we were there, and there's a whole bunch of Marines that are there, and we all got to talking about our faith. And they're around a fire, and in a tent being rained on, and it was just miserable that was out there. We all decided, what if we took communion? And we didn't have grape juice or bread or anything. We had a juice-like substance that we could get from an MRE package and MRE crackers. But that day, we did it. We took communion with each other. We remembered who Jesus was. We took communion. We read Bible passages that showed us that this is what this is for. And we all talked about what Jesus was doing in our lives, who he was to us. That's when communion, to me, became real. That was when all of a sudden it shifted from tradition and something that we just do to something that, no, we should be doing this, that this is important, that it's important for us. Now, I will tell you this, that there's a lot of times, and I would say this isn't just an FCC thing, this is an America thing. There's a lot of times in America and in the American church and times where we look at communion and it's just tradition. It's something that you do on Sundays. It's not something you can do at home. It's not something you can do at your groups. It's not something that you can do with your family. It's something you have to do on Sundays. And some churches do it every week. Some churches do it every other week. Some churches do it every month. Some every quarter. Some even once a year. But it's something that we do out of tradition. And for many people in America, America, communion has actually become something that is just a tradition. It's just the thing that you do. It's just the thing that we have to do. We're commanded to do it, but not necessarily something that we want to do. And how do we shift it? How do we shift it? Because it's important. And for many of you might actually be in that spot, that place where all of a sudden communion just doesn't mean very much to you. And some of you might be in that place where communion means everything to you. And some of you might be in the in-between. But I will tell you this, as Christians, as people that confess Jesus and say that we believe in Jesus, communion is important. It's important to come together over those elements, whatever elements that we have, even if it's MRE crackers, which are disgusting. They're kind of like the wafers we usually eat. But I will tell you, it's important. It's important. And I love that Jesus shows us how important it is. Jesus shows us how important that it is, not by just making it something like Jesus could have done anything when he talked about this. He could have done anything. He could have said, look, I want you to have a prayer time where you're just going to remember me. You're just going to do that. You're going to remember me. You could recite this prayer. This is what you're going to do. But Jesus didn't do that. Jesus didn't do that because Jesus knows people. Jesus knows people better than anybody, of course. And Jesus knows people, and he knows one thing, that when we remember things, it's not just with our faculties, with our memory, with our emotions, with who we are. It's not just that way that we remember, but we remember things also in a tactile way. We remember things from touch and smell and taste and all of that. And so around the table, Jesus is there on the last days. On the last day, he's around the table and he uses something that is tactile, something that was already there at the table. And he says, look, this is going to help you to remember me. Now, you see that in the Gospels. You see that in the Gospels. We also see it in 1 Corinthians. And Paul says this, and this is one of my favorite communion verses of all because it puts it so succinctly and sets it in a great way. It's in 1 Corinthians 11:23 through 28. It says, for I received from the Lord the teaching that I passed on to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, took a piece of bread, gave thanks to God, and broke it, and said, this is my body, which is for you. This is my body, which is for you. Imagine if you were there at that table and you're realizing that you're hearing Jesus. From his very last message, you're hearing Jesus, and he's saying, look, I'm going to be broken. I'm about to break this body for you. Imagine being there, how incredible that was. And he says, do this in memory of me. And in the same way, after the supper, he took the cup and he said, this cup is God's new covenant, sealed with my blood. Whenever you drink it, do so in memory of me. And then Paul, he goes beyond it. And he says this means that every time you eat this bread and drink from this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. That every time you take it, you proclaim the Lord's death. That you are proclaiming Jesus. Proclaiming Jesus in your lives and the lives around you. That's huge. That's huge. That's why we do this, is we're proclaiming Jesus. We're inviting him in. Notice in this verse, though, in this verse and in other community verses, there is no place in there which tells you you're supposed to take it this often. You're supposed to take it every day. You're supposed to take it every week. You're supposed to take it every month. You're supposed to take it this. There is no restriction. You could take it every single day. Notice in this verse, too, there is no place in it that says you can't take it at home, that you can't be around with your family and talking amongst your family and saying, hey, guys, let's celebrate something. Let's talk about communion. Let's do communion together. There's nothing in this verse that says it must be done in a church. Where does that come from? How did that actually happen? Like, where did we actually start getting to that place where it was no longer in homes? And part of that actually comes from the very next verse that we see from Paul. Paul says this, he continues on in this verse. It says, it follows that if one of you eats the Lord's bread or drinks from his cup in a way that dishonors him, you are guilty of sin against the Lord's body and blood. So then you should each examine yourself first, and then eat the bread and drink from the cup. Now that's a challenging verse, and I hear that all the time, misquoted and misused. If you were to read the full chapter and the full chapter that goes beyond, and I invite you, go home and check it out, 1 Corinthians 11. But the whole chapter, when we put that into context, what was happening at the time was there was people in the church and at that time that were separating themselves. You had the rich people, and they were actually having the Lord's Supper, and they're doing their own thing with the Lord's Supper, and the poor people are like, nah, you're not getting this. No, this is for us over here. And they were separating, and they were doing it with the wrong heart. And then they started just eating a meal, but not with remembrance. And they were doing things with the wrong heart. And Paul says, no, you're supposed to do this with the right heart. You're supposed to do this with the right heart towards Jesus. Now, if we were to look through history, and you see through history in the medieval times and stuff like that, not the one in Los Angeles or Florida, but the actual like medieval times, the Middle Ages, all of a sudden, that was actually an age where there was less communion given than ever before. The reason why was because the priests controlled it. And they used that verse and they said, okay, look, you cannot take communion unless you have the right heart. And you don't have the right heart if you're not tithing this much to the church, or if you're not doing this, if you're not giving and serving and doing this, and again, if you're not tithing this much to the church. So in the Middle Ages, most people weren't allowed to take communion. They used it as a verse to restrict people. But again, nowhere in that verse does it say you have to do this in church. You have to do this in church on Sundays. You have to do this at this time frame. You can't do this at home. You have to have a priest that blesses it. You have to have a pastor that comes in and prays over it and pours it and does a whole thing with it. I will tell you that that's something that we recognize even here. Most Sundays the communion is served. Bev is the one that actually put it together, not me or Joel. No, nowhere in there does it say that this has to be this way. What it does say is it's about the heart. The heart that you have when you're taking it. Whatever you're taking with it, what is your heart? What is your heart behind it? Are you remembering Jesus in it? Are you living with Jesus for it? Are you actually having a heart for Jesus? The early church, they did this. They knew this. They came around the table, and we see in Acts that there's tons and tons of different meals, tons of meals that they were living together, they were eating together, they were doing things together all the time. But the early church, we have records that show that they would also take communion at different times. They would take them when there was joyful celebrations. They would take them at funerals. They would take communion at any time they wanted to remember Jesus. It didn't have to be that we are all coming together in a programmed special way. What it was we're going to come around the table and we're going to talk about who Jesus is to us, why we love Jesus, what Jesus is doing. We're going to invite Jesus in. We're going to recognize that he's here with us, and we're going to take communion to remember him. That was the early church. The early church did that around tables, and we can do that around tables too. Hence, tables that you all are at. We could do that around tables as well, but where did we go wrong in America, where so many people in America just no longer value it? Younger generations say, well, it doesn't mean anything. Can't do it anymore. It's tradition. It's just tradition. That's it. Doesn't mean anything. Well, where did we go wrong? I have some ideas of where we went wrong. I have some ideas of what it is that we've done and where we need to actually adjust. Not just FCC. I'm saying this is the whole nation, America. But before I tell you those ideas, I want to show you a video. It's a video that I got off of Facebook. It's a video that somebody had actually posted, and then I reposted, and then there's a whole bunch of people that reposted this thing. It's like 1 million view video, stuff like that, and many of you have probably already seen it. It has nothing to do with communion. It has nothing to do with communion per se, but it does have to do with the church, and it does have to do with us. And I wanted to show it to you because this week, as I was thinking about communion, and as I'm continually praying over the church and the community that right now we have 90% unchurched in Port Orchard, as I'm praying over the community and I'm thinking about that, I'm thinking, man, where did we go? Where do we do? How do we actually adjust that? And I watched this video again and again, and all of a sudden, things just started to pop out. I started to go, man, I think the church needs to see this to know it. This is a video that is actually from Wayne Cordeiro. Cordero, there you go, yeah. From Awaken Leadership, the Awaken Leadership Conference. And I want you guys to check it out and listen in here.
Let me finish with this story. We go to China from time to time, and we train leaders. And this time we brought up 22 leaders from the Hunan province, and they rode 13 hours on a train to get to a hotel that they came up 2 by 2 in these elevators so as to not draw any attention. And then they got to a hotel room, a little apartment room. It's only about 700 square feet. In the little living room, no air conditioning, hardwood floor, 22 sat there. I came in, and when you teach in China, you start at 8 in the morning and you don't get done till 5 at night. You teach the whole day. They were sitting there, all 22 of them, and I looked around and I said, now, if we get caught, what will happen to me? They said, oh, you'll get deported in 24 hours and we'll go to prison for 3 years. I said, you're kidding. How many of you have been in prison for your faith? Out of 22, 18 raised their hands. I thought, no way. And I looked at him and I said, you 22 people, how many people do you oversee? Because they were all of these small group leaders, underground church leaders in the Hunan province. I said, how many, if you counted up all the people under your jurisdiction, how many would it be? And they counted them up and they said, little over 20 million. I said, what? See, we forget there's 1.3 billion people in China. This is crazy. Well, I had 15 Bibles, and I passed them out. Obviously, 7 didn't get them. And I said, let's turn to 2 Peter chapter 1, and we're going to read it. And just then, one lady handed hers to somebody next to her. And I thought, interesting. Well, we turned there anyway, and as we started reading it, I understood why she gave it away. She had memorized the whole thing. She just recited the whole chapter. When it was done, I went over to her at a break, and I said, you recited the whole chapter. She says, oh, yes, I've memorized many chapters. I said, where did you memorize so many chapters? She said, in prison. I said, you have much time in prison. So I said, but don't they confiscate the Bible? And she said, yes. So people bring in scriptures written on pieces of paper, and they bring it in. So I said, but then if they find that piece of paper on you, won't they confiscate that? She said, oh, yes, that's why you memorize it as fast as you can. Because even though they can take the paper away, they can't take what's hidden in your heart. I thought, wow. Well, after 3 days, you fall in love with these people. And when it was done, I said, how can I pray for you? I'm going to go back to America, and you guys have been just so wonderful. How can I pray for you? They said, you know, Wayne, you guys can gather like this whenever you want to in America. We can't. Could you pray that one day we'll be just like you? And I looked at him and I said, I will not do that. Big incredulous eyes looked at me and they said, well, why? I said, because you guys rode a train for 13 hours to get here. In my country, if you've got to drive more than an hour, people don't come. You sat on a wooden floor for 3 days. In my country, if people have to sit more than 40 minutes, they leave. You sat not only here for 3 days on a hard wooden floor, but you did it without air conditioning. In my country, if it's not padded pews and air conditioning, people don't often come back. In my country, we have an average of 2 Bibles per family. We don't read any of them. You hardly have any Bibles, and you memorize them from pieces of paper. I will not pray that we become like, you become like us, but I will pray that we become just like you.
Just like him, or like them in China. Man, when I look at that video, and I was watching that video, I'm not an emotional guy. I'm not a very emotional dude. My wife tells me that all the time. But I will tell you this, I got emotional on that. Because what has happened? What has happened in America where we want the convenience and the comforts instead of Jesus? Instead of Jesus, what is happening? That we decide, man, we're not going to read the Bible unless it's convenient or unless I want something from God. I'm not going to go to church unless it's within 10 to 15 minutes of my house and it starts out at the exact time that I want it. I will tell you this, one of the biggest calls we get here is, do you guys have a church service that is at 8:15? I can only go to a church service at 8:15. Like, wow. I want to see America actually get to a place that's like China. I want to see Port Orchard get to a place that's like China. And I will tell you, when I'm seeing this video and I hear that line about this woman, this poor woman that is memorizing scripture off of a piece of paper that they take away. And then she says, well, if they take it away, they can't take away what's on our hearts. I just want to go out in the streets and start screaming, what's on your hearts? What's on our hearts, Christians? What's on our hearts, community? What's on our hearts? Do we have Jesus on our hearts? Man, I hope so. Makes me want to run through the streets and start yelling out, come on, do you know Do you know, community, who Jesus is? Do you know who he is and how great he is and how he can change this community, how he can change your lives, how he can change the U.S.? Do you know who Jesus is? I will tell you that there is 20 million people in China right now that know how special and how amazing Jesus is. Do we know? So how did we get here? I started to think about that and pray about that even in communion. And what I kept coming back with was this. In the early church, people sat around tables when they took communion, and as they were taking communion, they talked about who Jesus was to them. In China right now, they don't invite you straight to church. Like, they don't come up to you and say, hey, you want to come to church? And by the way, you're going to take communion at church. They don't know what it is. They don't know anything about it. I have a friend of mine that's a missionary in China. I talked to him and I said, how do you guys do it? What do you do? And he says, well, we don't invite them to church. We don't invite them to communion. We don't do any of that. What we do is we go up to people and we share a story. I said, you share a Bible story? No. We share a story about who Jesus is to us. And then we show them the Bible. Because the same that Jesus is to us, Jesus can be to them. And then we talk about it around the tables with each other. It's amazing. When I look at that, I started to realize that, you know what? We stopped in America doing that. We stopped sharing stories. Here in America, we actually got to a place where our faith, where we decided, okay, well, our faith is our private thing. It's our thing that we do. We don't need to share it. It's not an outward focused thing. I go to church on Sunday. That's my private thing. That's my private life. That's my private thing. And we made it to where our faith is our own. And our faith is our own, but our faith is also supposed to be shared with the world, and we lost that because we stopped sharing stories. So today, I wanted to do something different. I wanted to do something a little uncomfortable. Because here's the thing. I believe that you all can take communion together. You could take it at your house. You could take it with your friends. You can do this together. The Bible tells us that we can. And the early church shows us that we can actually communicate together. We can come together. Communion is all about communion. The word communion actually means coming together with God. And we can invite Jesus in, and I believe that we can all do this together. So I want to challenge you today. And instead of making a challenge that you're going to do at the end of church and you're going to do throughout the week, I want you to do the challenge right now. Today at your tables. Today at your tables, you have all of the elements for communion. You have bread, and you have Welch's grape juice. You have bread and you have juice. You have the ability to do this. And it's not broken for you because you have to break the bread. You have to pour the juice yourselves, and you have to talk about it. If you look underneath your bread, there's a little sheet of paper there with a whole bunch of things for you to do. And here's what I want you to do is just kind of follow in those steps. For the next 10 minutes of service, instead of me preaching, instead of me talking, I want you all to do the preaching to your table. I want you all to look at those things, and I want you to tell stories with each other. What does Jesus mean to you? Do you have a story? Who is Jesus to you? And if you don't have a story for that, that's okay. And one of the things I want to stress here, I'm not requiring everybody to speak up. You don't have to, like, if you're somebody and you're like, okay, I can't talk. I'm not going to talk. I don't have a story yet. That's okay. Just listen. Listen to the people at the table, but I want you guys to share stories together. Who is Jesus to you? Why do you believe in Jesus? And then reflect on the verses that are there. And together, take communion, break the bread, have somebody at your table pray and say, yes, Jesus, we believe in you. Jesus, we want you to be with us, and we're taking this in honor and remembrance of you. Invite Jesus to your table. Invite Jesus into your table and be with him. Communicate together. So right now, we're going to do that. And I want you guys to turn to it, look through the steps, go check it out. We're going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to be going around. Joel's going to be going around. If you have any questions or concerns, or you want advice on how to pray or anything like that, or conversation starters, let us know. But for the next 10 minutes, go ahead and communicate at your table. I want to point out a couple of things here. As we talk about communion today, how many of you for the very first time prayed out loud in front of people? How many of you, and this was something that happened at a couple tables, how many of you kept eating the bread after you took communion? There was a lot of questions, people saying, well, wait a minute, are we allowed to do that? Yes. That is what they did in the early church, was they came together around a meal, and together they communed together, and they talked about Jesus, and they talked about the stories and the things that Jesus was doing in their lives, and they made sure that everybody knew what Jesus was doing. You know, oftentimes we get to a place where we feel a little lost and we're not sure where Jesus is in our lives. And sometimes it's helpful for us to actually hear that from someone else. What is Jesus doing? And then take communion together, be a part of something together. Be a part of something that's bigger than all of us. Because when we take this body and bread and we take it in this way, we're not just taking it together with us. If you looked at that verse, we're actually taking it as one loaf and one blood. It connects us to everybody in the past that believed in Jesus and did this too. It connects us to everybody in the future. And it shows us how powerful and how amazing Jesus is. Helps us to remember him, not only in memory, emotion, but remember him in taste and smell. All of a sudden, things become different. Man, I wish we have a community. I'll tell you this way. I've been praying this all week long. When I started looking at the statistics and finding out that Port Orchard is 90% unchurched, I started to think back, what if we started sharing our stories? What if we did things a little different? What if we shared our stories with our friends and our neighbors and we invited them in for dinner? And what if dinners eventually in your groups and your neighbors turned into communion and actually taking the body and blood and getting to know each other together? I think things would change. Things would change in Port Orchard. Things would change in America. Things would change all around. I want to see that happen, and I pray that happens. But it starts here with us knowing this and having communion together around tables in the way that connects us to the early church.